Hi folks, Lou here, and starting with tying negotiations in games into this, I'm going to talk about negotiations for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, in game design terms, if players have no way to help each other, why would they negotiate? Now, that's true for a vast number of low interaction games, such as parallel competitions, or what some people call multiplayer solitaire, or single player games, because in single player games there's no one to negotiate with. We can see negotiation as a way for the entities involved to help each other to a solution to a problem. It's not like horse trading or haggling to establish a price. It's much more complex. If there is no place where the two parties' demands or goals coincide, how can there be any negotiations, let alone an agreement? That's the situation in Ukraine. So whether talks take place or not, nothing can come of it at this time. And this time is early December 2022. Sometimes there's no other way to reach a common view of reality than settling things on the battlefield. That's a big reason why wars occur, which amounts to incompatible views of reality that can only be settled by conflict, unfortunately. Now, there's not much negotiation in games in general these days. Contemporary gamers are more accustomed to puzzles than actual games. They play video games, and the tabletop games they play tend to be puzzles. And there's a big difference between a puzzle and a game. A puzzle has an always correct solution. A game does not. If a game has a dominant strategy, as it's called, an always correct solution, then it's not a game anymore, it's a puzzle. Many of the contemporary gamers don't want to be bothered by the other players. They want to do their own thing in the game, even though there are other players involved. So we see less negotiation in games in general than we used to, both by design and by the inclination of the players. Two-player negotiation is a special case that you don't see generally in games. The real world is different from a game. Each nation in the real world has to concern itself with many others. Two-player games, on the other hand, are only about the game. They're not about others in any way, not other nations or anything else. Because games have endings. You play the game and then it's done. Unlike the real world keeps going on, and you have to be concerned about what you've settled on in negotiations. So at some point, your typical commercial game is not going to illuminate the situation of a two-player negotiation in the real world. So what are the prospects for negotiation in Ukraine? I could have titled this Negotiations for Ukraine War, but that wouldn't have made clear the root of the problem. The root is Russia invaded Ukraine for one reason only, to obliterate that nation. Nothing else makes sense. Denazification is a joke, but even if Ukraine had been Nazi, that wouldn't have justified an invasion. So this is put together in a nutshell by something that Golda Meir said. And older listeners remember when she was the Israeli prime minister and how much people generally admired her. As it happens, she was born and raised in Kiev in the Ukraine. She said, quote, "You cannot negotiate peace with someone who has come to kill you," unquote. Let me repeat, you cannot negotiate peace with someone who has come to kill you. And I would add, you can't negotiate peace with someone who has repeatedly reneged on her responsibilities in previous treaties, which is Russia. Now, why shouldn't the West, for example, push Ukraine into negotiations as some have suggested? Well, the Ukrainians are fighting and dying in a fight NATO would have to undertake if Ukraine was lost. It's much cheaper to give Ukraine weapons and money, often old weapons, than to fight the Russians in the Baltic states, Poland, etc. This is why Poland and the Baltics are the most enthusiastic Ukraine supporters. They know who's next on the Russian agenda. Only a fool would choose to be cheap now just to pay much more, especially in our blood, later. Right now, the Ukrainians are providing all the blood. People wanting Ukraine to negotiate now are just lazy, unwilling to take some heat or cold in order to prevent much worse later. This is typical short-termism of the 21st century, but it's stupid. Common views of reality are key to negotiations. If the two sides have significantly different ideas about the situation and about what is likely in the future, how can they achieve an agreement? On the other hand, the 21st century seems to be the era of wishful thinking, of cloud cuckoo land, and it's worldwide. Evidently, the Russians still think they're a great power in control of a large part of the world, as when they were the USSR. So their idea of legitimate security concerns is bizarre. It generally includes total domination or control of a lot of foreign countries and ignoring entirely their legitimate security concerns. Now, that brings up the topic of security guarantees. There's a lot of talk of security guarantees in negotiations. It's common for advertisers in America to talk about guaranteed this or that, but those guarantees are worthless. No guarantee is worth a thing unless there are penalties that can be enforced when the guarantee fails. And in international diplomacy, such penalties are hard to create and enforce. For example, the so-called guarantees in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that caused Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal to Russia. Ukraine had security guarantees from both Russia and the USA. That hasn't helped Ukraine in the slightest. Now, what does President Zelensky of Ukraine say? Quote, giving up any element of someone else's security to Russia means new war, unquote. Quote, Russia, will certainly break any agreements reached with them, unquote. It's like trusting someone in the game diplomacy who is known to be a frequent liar and backstabber. It's a stupid thing to do. Well, if we ask Ukraine to negotiate right now, we're asking them to be stupid. Now, ideally in negotiations, you come to a win-win agreement where both sides feel that they've been successful, even though they probably haven't got everything they wanted. And this requires finding common standards of measurement, which requires a very clear view of reality. If you can agree to standards, you can hope to come to an agreement. But I think again of Golda Meir's statement, what standards can you find with someone who came to kill you? Common standards aren't likely to exist, at least not with Putin or the hawks in power in Russia. And there's a well-known book called Getting to Yes about negotiations. This requires recognition that both sides compromise, but neither side wishes to compromise sufficiently in Russia-Ukraine. So successful negotiations are unlikely until one side or the other, or both, change their points of view and are willing to compromise. Can Putin compromise and stay in power? Maybe not. If not, then there will be no meaningful negotiation until he's out. For example, what makes sense for him is to agree to pull out entirely in return for the end of sanctions. But is he going to be able to maintain power if he does that? Possibly not. Maybe probably not. So we have unresolvable differences. Ukraine insists that Crimea must be returned to the Ukraine. Russia insists that it's an alienable part of Russia, even though before 2014 and for many years before that, it was part of Ukraine. Then the only resolution is military. And even then, can there be a stable peace? Ukraine will have to become an armed camp henceforth. They can't rely on what Russia says it will do. In those situations, the sanctions will likely remain on Russia for many years, and Russia will sink back into the Stone Age, so to speak. What are Putin's alternatives? He's unwilling to compromise, so he's going to look for alternative ways of pursuing the war. And the alternatives keep coming up. They were hoping that their newly mobilized people would make a difference. They haven't really. They're hoping next year's annual conscripts will turn the tide. But more new men are not going to make a difference because men are not what wins wars these days. They're hoping to freeze with temperature Ukraine into submission by bombing their civilian power infrastructure. But that's most unlikely to happen because the Ukrainians hate the Russians. And historically, attacks on civilians do not win wars. Or Putin is hoping to force Belarus to attack, as though little Belarus is going to make a big difference. The Ukrainians are ready for it, and it might backfire on Russia because the Belarusians might decide they don't want to have the Russians deciding what they do and kick them, as well as Lukashenko, out of the country. Or they're hoping Western support dries up. But however much the Europeans get wimpy, the ones on the battle line, the Baltics, Poland, they are not going to stop supporting Ukraine because they know who's next. And the USA and UK are not going to stop supporting Ukraine. So this is hopeless. But Putin is in a form of cloud cuckoo land. So it looks like it's going to be a long war to me, quote unquote. So far, it has been a short war by historical standards. Historically, wars last several years, if not much longer. And this one has been going for, 9 or 10 months. Thanks for listening.